しもし。お疲れ様です。そうなんです。明日は私早上がりで5時には出られますから、久しぶりに外で部長にお会いできます。病院も刺激的ですけど、たまには違うところも嬉しいです。うちの人は本当に大丈夫です。明日は夜勤交代して泊まりだって言ってありますから。帰ってきた。じゃあ失礼します。ごめんなさい。
もう汗かいちゃった。ちょっとシャワー浴びるから。
じゃあ出たらご飯作るわね。
ありがとう。
It was a peaceful afternoon in a quiet corner of Japan. The kind of afternoon where the sun spills gently across the floor, and time seems to slow just enough for you to breathe in the comfort of home. Yumi was folding laundry in her small but warm apartment, her sanctuary. Married for several years, she had built a life with her husband filled with trust, laughter, and a steady rhythm of simple joys. The doorbell rang. It wasn't loud, not startling, just there. Yumi glanced toward the door with mild curiosity.
はい。少々お待ちください。
When she opened it, a woman stood there, smiling a kind smile, the kind that carries both warmth and restraint. Hello, the woman said politely. I'm Yui. I've just moved in next door.
おそばどうぞ。すいません、ご丁寧に。じゃあ頂戴いたします。こちらこそよろしくお願いします。風間と申します。
For a brief second, Yumi's heart
も
skipped.
しかして
It wasn't recognition in the usual
はい、
sense,
旧姓は
not
三
the
田ですけど。
immediate click of memory, but more like a whisper in the back of her mind. Something
ユミ先輩。
familiar.
そうよ。
Oh, welcome, Yumi replied, returning the smile naturally. I'm Yumi. They exchanged a few pleasantries, the kind neighbors share when meeting for the first time. But under the surface of their smiles, there was something else. Not tension, not discomfort, but history.
本当に
Because the truth was, this wasn't their first meeting. Years ago, in a very different time, in a very different setting, they had once worn the same white uniforms, worked the same long shifts, walked the same halls in a small local hospital. Yumi and Yui were once colleagues, partners in the demanding world of healthcare. And like many professional relationships under pressure, theirs had been a mixture of admiration and quiet friction.
先輩。
Back then, both women were in their 20s, eager, passionate, and perhaps a little idealistic. They didn't dislike each other, not really, but they were different. Yumi was meticulous and reserved, while Yui had a more spontaneous energy, often relying on her instincts and people skills. In a high-stakes environment, those differences weren't always easy to reconcile. It wasn't unusual for them to clash silently behind polite exchanges. Assignments were carried out with professionalism, but conversations were often short, sometimes stiff. Looking back now, it was clear they hadn't yet developed the tools to truly listen to one
あなたも
another,
結婚したのに。
not just with their ears, but with
主
understanding.
人は石原さん
And
の
then
じゃない
there was the patient. Neither of them had thought
あ
about
れ
him
から
in
半年
years,
ほどして
not
石原さんに
directly,
は振られました。
not until
好きな
now.
人ができたって。
He had been transferred to their unit unexpectedly,
じゃあ二
just
人と
for
も
a few
振られたっ
weeks
て
of
ことね。
recovery. But what made his presence
だったらあ
stand
の
out
時あな
wasn't
たが
his
病院を
medical
することも
condition.
なかったのにね。
It was the fact that,
結果的にそう
coincidentally,
ですけど。
he was someone both
でもそれ
women
で
had known
今の主人に
before,
出会いましたのでよかったん
not
だ
at
と
the
思いま
same
す。
time, and not
5
in
年
the
ほど
same
この
way,
土地を離れていま
but
したが
enough to stir old
まさかま
memories,
た
gentle
先輩にお会い
ones,
するなんて。
of youth, of springtime conversations, of
私もあれ
first
からしばら
feelings,
くして病院を
unspoken
変わって
and unresolved.
主人と3年前に
Still,
結婚して
nothing
風間
dramatic
になったの。
happened. No arguments. No
今は看護師
accusations.
長になったのよ。
Just space. A growing space between them.
でもこの
Misunderstandings
自
that
宅
were
に
never
来たってこ
voiced.
とはまた同
Moments
じ
that were
職場になるって
misread.
ことよね。
Conversations that never took place.
あなたが優秀なこと
Over
は知ってる
time,
から
their shifts
歓迎
changed.
するわ。
Yui left the hospital not long after.
個人的にはいろいろ
Yumi
あったけ
stayed
ど
for a few more
これ
years,
からまた
eventually meeting the man who would become her husband.
私こそよろ
Life
し
moved
くお願い
forward,
します。
as it always does.
じゃあ
Paths
失礼
diverged.
します。
Distance did what time always hopes it will do it, soften the edges. But now, here they were again, older, quieter, wiser. Was this just a coincidence? Or something more? After Yui left, Yumi turned back, just as her husband walked into the room.
どうした誰か来てた？
ああ、引っ越しの挨拶。そしたら昔の後輩でちょっと話してた。これいただいたわ。
そんなこともあるんだ。まあここ病院の社宅だからね。
そうね。
そしたら今日の昼そばにする？
そうね、今ね。じゃあ準備するわ。
And that was all she said. Because sometimes the most profound things don't need to be explained. They just are. And maybe, just maybe life was offering them both a second chance, not to relive the past, but to understand it better. The next few days passed quietly, as they often do in a peaceful neighborhood. But something had shifted within Yumi. She found herself thinking more than usual about the past, about that time in her life she had carefully placed in the background. Sometimes, life leaves pages unturned, not out of neglect, but because we believe we've outgrown them. And yet, when Yui reappeared, those pages fluttered open again, stirred by a breeze of memory that Yumi hadn't realized still lingered.
結婚して九州に行ったって聞いたけど戻ってきたんだ。畑野になったんだね。俺まあ独身。でもさ、ゆうちゃん前より綺麗になったね。
石原さん、勤務中ですから。
ちょっとくらい話したっていいでしょ。だってさ、他人のふりする方が変でしょ。
声が大きいですから。
いや、
他の方もいらっしゃいますし、迷惑になります。
でもさ、ゆうちゃん前よりずっと綺麗になったね。
やめてください。渡辺さん、大きな声出してどうしたんですか？いや、何でもありません。何でもないって。でもこちらのか。石原さん？
ゆみさん、どうして？
じゃあここが石原さんのベッドですから使ってください。あとここに置いておきますね。
ありがとうございます。でも本当僕びっくりしてます。ゆみさんとゆいちゃんが同じ病院で一緒に働いてるなんて。
そうね。彼女が旦那さんの転勤でこっちに戻ってきて一緒になったの。私もびっくりしてます。
仲良くやってるんですか？
ええ、まあだってあれは若い頃の話ですから。じゃあ検査はちゃんと受けてください。
She didn't go knocking on Yui's door. She didn't feel the need to chase the past, But one afternoon, as fate would have it, they ran into each other in the elevator. It was awkward for just a breath. Then they both laughed, a soft, almost involuntary laugh that broke the silence like sunlight through a cloud. They sat together at a quiet cafe down the street, not as former colleagues, not even really as friends, just as two people who had once shared a part of life's journey and now had a rare opportunity to revisit it with new eyes. It didn't take long for the conversation to move past the surface. They spoke of the hospital, the long nights, the endless paperwork, the patients who touched them, and the ones they still remembered. They talked about the pressure and the pride and the exhaustion. But most importantly, they spoke of themselves. Yui admitted that during those years, she had often felt misunderstood, like her instincts were brushed aside, or her choices constantly questioned. "I wasn't trying to be difficult," she said gently. "I just wanted to feel respected, heard." Yumi nodded. "I know. And I think, back then, I was too focused on doing things the right way. I didn't always take the time to see other ways, including yours." It wasn't a grand confession. There were no dramatic revelations, but something honest passed between them, acknowledgement of mistakes made, of emotions buried, of humanity shared. And then came the subject neither had brought up in years: the patient. There was a quiet pause before his name was spoken aloud, but once it was, it felt less heavy than expected, more like recalling a distant spring morning, bittersweet but gentle. He was kind and easy to talk to, Yui said. Yumi smiled, a touch of amusement in her eyes. He was charming. I remember thinking that, even when I tried not to. They both laughed softly. There was no jealousy now, no rivalry. What once could have grown into resentment had withered with time, replaced by something far more powerful: understanding. It was clear, in that moment, that the issue between them had never really been about a man. It had been about insecurity, about feeling unseen, about learning how to work with someone instead of around them. And maybe they were too young back then to know how. Yui stirred her coffee slowly. "I used to think you didn't like me." Yumi met her gaze, calm and clear. "I didn't know how to show that I respected you. I thought keeping distance was being professional." They both sat quietly for a moment, letting the truth settle not painfully, but peacefully, like dust gently landing after years of motion. Then Yui said something unexpected. "I was going through a difficult time back then. I had a lot going on outside the hospital that no one knew about. I think I carried it into work without realizing." Yumi didn't ask for details. She didn't need them, because sometimes offering space is more meaningful than asking for an explanation. And in that silence, she simply said, "I'm sorry you went through that alone." Yui blinked, caught off guard, not by the words, but by the fact that they mattered, even now. It was in that moment that both women realized something crucial. It's never too late to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. Even if the chapter has long since closed, healing can still happen between the lines. They walked back home together, their conversation softer now, filled with small stories, shared laughter, and the quiet comfort of new beginnings. And they did. Because sometimes resolution doesn't come with dramatic apologies or sweeping emotions. It comes with a shared cup of coffee, with simple words, with the courage to see someone fully for the first time. The next morning, the breeze was gentle, and sunlight filtered through the white curtains of Yumi's kitchen. As she poured tea into 2 cups, the doorbell rang. It was Yu smiling softly, holding a small bag of homemade pickled plums. Yumi invited her in without hesitation. This time, there was no need for small talk. They sat on the balcony, just like old times, but with hearts a little less guarded. There was a moment of silence, not heavy, not awkward, just the kind that gently invites memories to surface. Yui took a breath. Do you still think about that patient? The one who brought everything to light back then? Yumi nodded, her eyes far away. I used to, a lot. Not just about him, but about us. About how we let our differences speak louder than our care. Back then, it wasn't just work tension. The patient they both cared for had been a quiet thread from their past, a figure from youth, whose condition brought buried emotions to the surface. The hospital's pressure only magnified the misunderstandings, and both women had struggled to stay professional while privately wrestling with emotion. I wasn't fair to you, Yui said gently. I thought silence would protect me, but it only created more distance. Yumi smiled not to dismiss the apology, but to acknowledge its weight. We were young. We didn't know how to say what hurt without sounding like blame. They shared stories of how life had unfolded since then, careers that shifted, people who left, dreams that changed form. Yui spoke of her decision to leave the hospital, not because of defeat, but because she needed to rediscover herself. Yumi listened, not with judgment, but with a calm understanding only time could teach. The afternoon wore on with quiet laughter and shared reflection. No one rushed to define what they were to each other now. They were simply present two women who had once stood on opposite shores of misunderstanding, now meeting in the middle. Later, as Yui stood to leave, she placed a small cloth-wrapped bundle on the table. For you, she said, just something to say. Thank you for this. Yumi didn't ask what it was. She just smiled and nodded. Come by again soon. When her husband returned home and asked, who came by? Yumi looked out toward the sunlit balcony and said with a serene voice, just an old acquaintance. Because sometimes reconciliation doesn't need grand gestures or long explanations. Sometimes all it takes is a shared cup of tea, a quiet afternoon, and two hearts willing to meet again, not to relive the past, but to peacefully close it. A few weeks later, the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet rhythm again. A gentle wind moved through the alleys, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain and possibility. Yumi was on the balcony, tending to her potted plants. She enjoyed this part of the day, the stillness, the care, the reminder that growth, no matter how slow, was always possible. A door opened nearby. Yui stepped out onto her own balcony. They exchanged a glance familiar now, comfortable. No need for formalities anymore, no hesitations. Just a quiet acknowledgement. We're okay. It was a simple exchange, nothing scripted, nothing extraordinary. But that's the beauty of it. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life come not with fireworks, but with peace, with stillness, with the gentle hum of two people who have found clarity not just with each other, but within themselves. That evening, the three of them, Yumi, her husband, and Yui shared a casual meal together. Light conversation filled the air about favorite foods, music from their school days, and funny neighborhood quirks. There was laughter, even a few thoughtful pauses, but there was no tension, no what-ifs, no rehashing of old wounds. Just presence, just grace. When Yui stood to leave, She said something that stayed with Yumi for a long time. I'm grateful we met again, not to fix the past, but to honor it. To finally see each other not as who we were, but as who we are now. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from changing the past, but from allowing it to rest in peace. As the door closed behind Yumi felt a warmth bloom in her chest, not just relief, but quiet pride. She had faced something unresolved, not with confrontation, but with compassion. She had let go of ego and gained something deeper, perspective. She had turned an old chapter, not to rewrite it, but to finally close it with care. That everyone you meet is carrying something. A story, a misunderstanding, a part of themselves they're still learning to forgive. And while we can't control how others behave, we can choose how we respond. We can choose patience over pride, curiosity over judgment, grace over assumption. Because at the end of the day, the real strength lies not in never having conflict, but in being willing to return to a place of understanding, even if it takes years to get there. Whether it's a friend you've lost touch with, a coworker you never quite clicked with, or a version of yourself you've avoided revisiting, it's never too late to soften, to listen, to grow. And sometimes, all it takes is one quiet moment, one gentle smile, one brave conversation to change everything. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the kind of way that stays with you. The kind that lets you breathe easier. The kind that reminds you, you're human, so are they. And that's more than enough. Thanks for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something important, share it with someone you care about. And remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones.